So I'm Ralph Metzner. I'm a professor here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I teach consciousness studies and ecological consciousness, eco-psychology. I'm also a psychotherapist. And I do workshops and trainings in different parts of the country and international. My most recent activity that I'm developing is a program in alchemical divination practices. The perceived limitations to the humanistic psychology, which is sometimes considered the third force, and then transpersonal would be a fourth force. The first two being behaviorism and psychoanalysis. When I went to graduate school, which was at Harvard in the late 50s, early 60s, those were the two main schools of psychology. Behaviorism, Skinnerian, very hardcore behaviorism, and psychoanalysis were two very different schools of thought. They even had different buildings on campus. Abraham Maslow developed the humanistic psychology approach. He and others, like Carl Rogers and so forth, feeling that, first of all, behaviorism didn't deal with your inner life at all, and then psychoanalysis only focused on pathology and neurotic behavior and not normal people. So that the humanistic psychology, which sort of fit with the humanistic psychology movement and things like the Esalen growth psychology idea, was ideas such as self-actualization, actualizing your hidden potentials, and self-actualization therapy, having complete unconditional regard for the other human being that you're doing therapy, not regarding them as a patient. Or traditional experimental psychology, which I was trained in, and it's always the doctor-patient or the experimenter subject. Those are both what people will call asymmetrical power relationships. I had one of my teachers at Harvard was Timothy Leary, and before he even got involved in psychoactive mushrooms and substances, he was very strong on this kind of fresh, very egalitarian approach to, he called it existential transactionalism. So treating people as equals, with respect, rather than telling them what they should do or shouldn't do. Humanistic psychology movement grew out of that attempt to look at ordinary people and how they developed, and studies of the life cycle and things like that. And then after a while, there was a humanistic journal and an association, and then after a while, Maslow and others, and people like Stan Grof and Anthony Suttage, also realized that even that wasn't going far enough, and that you really needed something to cover, to deal with the areas beyond the normality. In other words, and Maslow wrote a book about peak experiences. And then there were, around that same time, people started working with consciousness expanding drugs, that were called consciousness expanding drugs, that basically, now some people use them as adjuncts to psychotherapy dealing with neurotic problems. But other people felt there's other uses that seem to go into dimensions of what ordinarily in the past would have been considered the psychology of religion. William James, 1901, he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Religious experience. So Maslow and Grof and others felt they needed a new approach was needed to deal with areas beyond the normal, that are not pathological, but touch into areas of religion, mysticism, higher states of consciousness, the kinds of things that Eastern philosophy deals with a lot. And when I was working with Leary and Alpert at Harvard, and other graduate students as well in psychology, it was very clear after working with these substances for a while that were called psychedelic or mind manifesting, that the ordinary psychology suddenly Freudian depth psychology was completely inadequate. Behaviorism didn't even come close. There is no behavior to observe. And we did do this one study that was Leary's idea because, in terms of the colleagues, he said we can bring about behavior change and by giving the psychedelic drugs to prisoners and convicts in a prison. And then there would be a behavioral index of change would be the recidivism rate, if there's a change in the recidivism rate. We'd look at, other tests and so forth, but interviews, but also that would be a behavioral index, the behaviorist happy and so forth. Didn't quite work out that way because it's much more complicated to bring about changes in behavior that can be maintained. You may have to have a whole social support system. But that was the idea. But the focus was on states of consciousness. I would say I use the language of consciousness studies as a field within psychology equally as I do transpersonal psychology. The reason for that, because the area of consciousness is a little bit of a stepchild or in psychology, because psychology as part of the scientific worldview, even say as a social science within a social paradigm, there's not really that much study of consciousness. Because the mainstream scientific paradigm is a materialistic, mechanistic science view. So there's dozens and innumerable books about consciousness that are published every year. They all address basically the question, how can we explain consciousness in terms of the brain? In other words, or we could make computer models or information theory, cybernetics, all this kind of, and brain studies. I'm not saying that's not appropriate, but I've come to think, and I think along with most other people in the field of transpersonal or consciousness studies, that approach has its own inherent limitation. William James, interestingly enough, was far ahead of his time and even our time. And I've come to understand because William James had something that he called radical empiricism. That it was kind of I now think it's really the appropriate epistemology for the study of consciousness, because it says, it has two parts. The empirical part is all knowledge must be based on observation, on experience. That's what empiricism means. There has to be some observation, some data that you make. And all science accepts that. You don't get knowledge by just sitting around fantasizing, making things up. You get something, but you don't get true knowledge that you can work with. Radical empiricism was, and it was truly radical, even in William James's time, and even now, that no experience is excluded from becoming part of knowledge. And ordinary science doesn't do that. Ordinary science excludes certain realms of experience right away. For example, the way it deals with drug experiences, it says, oh, well, that's a drug effect. It puts it in the category of like drugs, like heart drugs and mind drugs. So, there's no true knowledge there. It's just a drug effect. You go, hallucinations, hallucinogenics, it produces hallucinations. Hallucinations to most people means illusions. So, not scientific. Religious experience is the same thing. Religious experience is not scientific because you can't basically study anything consciousness because there's nothing to see, nothing to observe, nothing to measure. Science wants to have it be measurable, observable. William James says, with radical empiricism, no phenomena are excluded. For example, also parapsychological phenomena. See, all was excluded from science, even although they make observations which are statistically valid, by the same criteria even. Like J.B. Ryan did all these experiments on parapsychology, but the scientists know. They said, a priori, from ideological grounds, we exclude that, because it can't possibly be true. And that, to me, and to William James, is not scientific. The scientific approach, the radical empirical approach, would be open to any kind of experience, and it doesn't exclude any observations based on preconceptions. And what makes it scientific is not where the observations come from, but what you do with them afterwards. In other words, you can make objective observations in your own consciousness. And that's why you have to do it in your own consciousness. And in fact, this is also why it ties into Eastern psychology, because in Eastern psychology, you have these practices of meditation. And in meditation, you're making systematic observations that have been accumulated and written down by yogis and meditators and mystics over the years, and they say, you do this meditation, you may have this kind of experience, and you do this one, you have this, and then these steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, like a very systematic, very scientific, over centuries, a phenomenal database. So, and William James himself was completely open. He looked at, well, let's look at mystical experiences. You don't dismiss it. Mainstream science and sort of mainstream conception, mysticism is sort of misty, it's kind of vague, right? If you look up in the dictionary, as one of the definitions, something misty, vague. It's the opposite. See, the mystics themselves say, not at all, I'm sorry. The mystic, when I had that experience, whether drug-induced or not, I had more certain knowledge than I do ordinarily. It's universal among mysticism. That's the certain knowledge. Doesn't come through the usual senses. And William James, and he studied parapsychological experiments, somnambulism, hypnotism, all kinds of unusual experiences. He studied psychedelic experiences. He took nitrous oxide. And he said, he had an amazing quotation. He said, I took nitrous oxide, and those experiments have convinced me that no account of human consciousness, all around our ordinary consciousness, separated by the filmiest of screens, lie other realms of reality. And no account of human consciousness that leaves these other realms out of account can be considered complete. What you experience is a function of your set and your setting, the set and the setting. The set being the internal expectations and belief systems that you bring to it, and the external environment in which you find yourself. And one of the classes I teach here at the Institute is where I use that general idea to look at all kinds of altered states of consciousness, including, for example, the ordinary states of consciousness that we're all familiar with, which we're very familiar. See, some people don't like the term altered states because they think it's automatically pathological or abnormal in some way. But I say alterations of consciousness are completely normal. Couldn't be more normal, because every day, every 24 hours, we cycle through sleeping and waking. That's an altered state, very profound altered state, which is thinking, feeling, perception, everything is completely different. Different laws of time and space, everything is different. Because self-concept, everything is different, just like you've taken a drug. And sometimes you did take a drug, a sleeping drug, or a wake-up pill, but we cycle through them. It's very normal. And then you can have other sort of meditative states. In fact, in Indian psychology, they recognized 4 different classical normal altered states of consciousness. They had a waking state, sleeping without dreams, and sleep with dreams, which they identified as 2 separate states. And then they had a 4th state they called it. The 4th state was kind of a meditative state, which I think is sort of like what now people call alpha wave state. When your brain is generating alpha waves between 8 and 12 cycles per second, where you're kind of in a relaxed, easygoing state. You're not particularly thinking. When you're thinking, your eyes are open and you get more fast frequencies. But anyway, it's interesting that the yogis and the meditators distinguished dreaming sleep and non-dreaming sleep, because it was only in the 50s that Western psychology was able to make that distinction. And because somebody discovered, a graduate student at the University of Chicago, working in a sleep lab, they found out that rapid eye movements phenomena, that mostly when you're dreaming, people's eyeballs move back and forth. REM sleep, they call REM sleep. And you wake up people when they're doing REM sleep, and they're 80% of the time they're reporting dreams. You wake them up when they're not doing REM, then they're not dreaming. So you had an external behavioral index of a subjective state. See, so then, and similarly with substances like LSD, you had an external catalyst that pretty reliably, given the appropriate set and setting, could induce mystical behaviorism, Skinnerian, very hardcore behaviorism, and psychoanalysis, but 2 very different schools of thought. They even have different buildings on campus. Abraham Maslow developed the humanistic psychology, approach. He and others, like Carl Rogers, and so on, feeling that first of all, behaviorism didn't deal with your inner life at all, and then psychoanalysis only focused on pathology and neurotic behavior and not normal people. So that the humanistic psychology, which sort of fit with the humanistic psychology movement and things like the Esalen growth psychology idea, was ideas such as self-actualization, actualizing your hidden potentials, and self-actualization therapy, having complete unconditional regard for the other human being that you're doing therapy, not regarding them as a patient, or traditional experimental psychology. So I'm Ralph Metzner. I'm a professor here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I teach consciousness studies and ecological and alchemical divination practices. The perceived limitations to the humanistic psychology, which is sometimes considered the third force, and then transpersonal would be a fourth force. The first two being behaviorism and psychoanalysis. When I went to graduate school, which was at Harvard in the late 50s, early 60s, those were the two main schools of psychology: business, eco-psychology. I'm also a psychotherapist. And I do workshops and trainings in different parts of the country and international. My most recent activity that I'm developing is a program